Hey there, and welcome to the next video in the Intro to Web Dev series. In this video, we're going to talk about for loops, which let you write code that kind of repeats itself. So I'm going to run through this kind of written tutorial verbally, and so yeah, that's the plan. All right, so to get started, I have my handy dandy Scratch folder. I just have some baseline files here. So I've got index.html and script.js are the files I'm going to be messing with today. So I'm going to open those up in Atom, and I have my nice editor here, and I'm going to also open it up in my browser. So let me kind of rearrange my windows a little bit so that I can kind of have my code on the left and my browser on the right. So here's my code right now. It's kind of some static HTML, and it has a script.js file that right now just logs something to the console. Okay, there we go. Before we dive into this week, I want to maybe review what we learned about last time, and that was if statements. So if statements are a way to conditionally run code. So you can have something like maybe a variable called, I don't know, value equals some number. And then I can say if that value is greater than some other number, then do something. And I'll maybe write something to the screen. Document.write, hello. Or maybe I'll say like greater than, whatever. Okay, so let's run that code and see what happens. So I'm going to refresh, and there we have our greater than, and this will only be triggered if the value is indeed greater than this number. So I can maybe make this a smaller number and run the code and see what happens. And we no longer see that message. We just see what was in the HTML by default here. So I'm going to maybe get rid of this because I don't actually care about the content of the HTML itself. I'm going to mess around in JavaScript only. So here what's happening is because the value is less than 37, this if statement checks this Boolean expression, and since it's false, it does not run the if statement. Okay, so those are if statements. That's a little bit of review, and I wanted to do that because for loops kind of take this idea of writing code that changes how your code is run. If statements conditionally run code, and for loops are similar, only they repeat code. So I think I'm going to just dive right into the syntax actually. So let me kind of clear some of this out and give myself some room. So a for loop is a new set of like syntax rules, and so I'm just going to type it here, make my text a little bit bigger so you can see it. Okay, so here we go. We're going to write a for loop that repeats some line of code 10 times. So how I do that is I start with the for keyword, FOR, and then in parentheses I'm going to type some things, and those things are three things. First, I need to create a variable, and I'm going to set it equal to 0 at first. We will talk about that in a second. This variable is often called like index or I, depending on what you're using it for. And then the second thing that you give a for loop after the semicolon is a Boolean expression, very similar to a if statement. So I'm going to say index is less than 10. And then another semicolon, and then the third thing that you give a for loop is an increment. So in this case, I'm going to say that index is going to equal itself plus 1, and you can shorten this syntax to index plus plus, which does the exact same thing. It increases a variable by 1. Okay, so that's the sort of definition of the for loop. I actually don't know what this line is called, but whatever. It's setting up our for loop. And then very similar to if statements, you want curly braces. And then between those curly braces, you write whatever code you want to repeat. So let's do this, document.write. And maybe I'll have a p tag or something that says index and I'll also write the index to our page. Okay, so this line of code writes a string using the string append operator here to create a string, which is a p tag, and it contains the text index, and then it prints the value of the index to the page as well. And I'm just going to save this and run it and see what happens. And you can see that what happened was I printed 10 total times index followed by a number. So index is 0, then index is 1, then index is 2, blah, blah, blah. So on and so forth. Notice that it's 10 total times because index starts at 0 and stops when it's equal to 10. So when this is false, it's a little wonky to get used to, but with after you see it a few times, it kind of becomes more natural. But anyway, the variable that we created here increases by 1 each time, and we see that in the page. Okay, so I'm going to maybe take a second to take apart this syntax a little bit, because it's kind of a lot. For loops do a lot with just a little bit of syntax. So this one line is doing quite a bit of heavy lifting. So I'm going to introduce some white space. JavaScript does not care about white space, so this is purely for my brain to make it a little easier to read, but JavaScript itself doesn't really care about white space. So I'm going to do it this way. And it's the same code. All I've done is introduce some white space to make it easier to talk about. I'm going to save that and refresh it just to actually confirm. Okay, so it's still doing the same thing. So to talk about what a for loop does in more detail, I'm going to look at each of these things one at a time. So the for keyword tells the code that we are about to define a repeating pattern. And that repeating pattern needs 3 things. It needs the value that it starts at. So in our case, it's 0. And then the value that it ends at. In this case, it ends at 10, but it does not include 10 because it's only valid if the index is less than 10. So 9 is less than 10, 10 is not less than 10. And we can change this in a second, and we'll see different ways to approach that. But this is basically how many times to loop, or when to stop looping is maybe a better way to say that. And then this third thing is how much the loop changes per iteration, so each step. And so I can start playing with some of these things. So here I started at 0. Let's see what happens if I start at, say, 5. And so I'm going to refresh, and now you see that index starts at 5, and it still goes until index is no longer less than 10. So you've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and it still increases by 1 each time. So I can change this. So I can change to like a less than or equal to. Actually, let me change this back to 0, and I'll refresh here. So you might, if you were looking at this, you might say, oh, this for loop loops 10 times, but it actually loops 11 times because it includes the 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's actually 11 values because it includes the 0. That'll become more important when we get to arrays, but for now, just kind of keep in mind that if you start your loop at 0, then this number, this Boolean expression should probably be less than if you're trying to loop a certain number of times. Anyway, so that's 0 to 9, and then the other thing I want to play with is maybe like instead of index plus plus, which again increases a variable by 1, what I'm going to do is like index equals index plus, let's say, 3. And this line, this syntax can be shortened because adding a value to a variable is so common that it has a shortcut. So I'm going to say plus equals, which is the exact same thing as saying index equals itself plus 3. So add 3 to that variable. So I'm going to refresh and see what happens. And there you see, index starts at 0, but goes up by 3 each time and still stops when it's no longer less than 10. So it's at 9, and then it's going to increase by 3 and be at 12, and this will start to fail. Okay, so I think I've talked in pretty good detail about each individual part of the for loop. So I want to put it back to the kind of syntax that you'll see most often, which is having it on one line. Okay, so now I have it on one line, and nothing has changed. It'll still do the exact same thing. I'm just removing the white space to make it a little easier to read. And what I want to talk about next is kind of how to read the for loop. So when you get to a for loop in your code or in someone else's code, first what you want to do is sort of look at each of those three sections one at a time, and that's what we just kind of did. So reading through code is super important, and the way that you do it is you read line by line. So maybe you would start over your index.html file and you would see body on load equals load. So you would say, okay, when the page loads, it's going to call this load function. All right, so you jump over to the script.js file and you see this, and you'll read through this line by line. So you see console.log hello world, so you know that the code will print this message to the console. Then you keep reading, and the next line is a for loop, and so you read the three things that tell you like the behavior of the loop, and then you read the body of the for loop. So in this case, it's document.write index, and then the index variable. And here's where sort of the magic happens. When the code reaches the end of the body of the loop, so in other words, when it gets here, after whatever last line is inside of the curly braces, basically when it reaches the bottom curly brace, what the code does is it jumps back to the top. So it goes back to the for and rechecks the, actually first when it reaches the bottom, then it does this, this increment. So I am going to start my loop at 0, and I'm going to print index of 0. And then I reach the end, and this part runs. So now my index is 3. And then the code jumps up here. It skips the creation of the variable after the first iteration of the loop, and then checks the Boolean expression here. And since 3 is less than 10, then it does indeed run this line of code. Now it says index is 3. It prints index 3 to the page here. It gets to this, the bottom of the for loop, runs this again. Now index is 6. Jumps back to the top, checks if index is less than 10. 6 is less than 10. So we run the body of the for loop again. We print index of 6. And, you see the pattern. It gets to the bottom, index plus equals 3. Index is now 9. So then it jumps to the top and says, is 9 less than 10? Yes, it is. So we print that. And finally, okay, here's where it might get interesting. We get to the bottom and we say index plus equals 3. So now it's 12. Okay. And so it jumps up to the top and it says, is 12 less than 10? And this is very similar to an if statement. Since 12 is not less than 10, this is false, and the code skips the body of the for loop and runs whatever code is down here. So maybe I'll say like document.write done looping, just to kind of show the order of things. So index starts out at 0, we loop a few times, in this case 4, and then we continue running whatever code is after the for loop. Again, very similar to how if statements work, but instead of conditionally running code or not, we are repeating code. Okay, I think that's about as far as I want to go with for loops. It's kind of this weird new syntax, so I want to kind of leave it there and let it kind of sit and marinate. I'll say that if you want more practice, there are a couple of exercises that might be fun. So something like the 99 bottles of beer on the wall, or juice or chocolate milk, whatever your drink of choice is. But this is a song that has a lot of repeated lyrics, and actually this is funny, the Wikipedia article for 99 bottles of beer on the wall talks about using code to do it. That's funny. Anyway, anytime you have like a pattern of something repeating, you should think about using a for loop, because computers are really, really good at doing really boring things, like just repeating the same thing over and over again with like minor changes. So for example, what we did with the index here, this is basically the same thing over and over again, just with one minor change. 99 Bottles of Beer in the Wall is exactly that. It's a song that has mostly the same lyrics except for the number in it. So you might write a JavaScript program or function, whatever you want to call it, that draws that to a web page. And it's a lot easier to write a for loop that does the same thing 99 times than it would be to write 99 lines of HTML. There's other things you can do. There's a song that never ends. I thought that would be a funny thing to play around with. You could sing the song that never ends 1,000 times pretty easily with a for loop, and that's kind of the power of a for loop, is it gets your code to repeat patterns. But anyway, that's about as far as I'm going to go with for loops, because really the reason I'm talking about them is because they are really useful when we get to arrays, which is the next video. So for now, I will stop there, and I'll say thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.